I was just listening to one of these beautiful lectures of Jacques Derrida, which I'll include, although I'm not really going to comment on it. But thinking of this notion of the beautiful works, the Calon, or the somehow noble works in contradistinction to the good or the sound or the most perfect works. Let's wonder if, yeah, let's say just a distinction like that seems to carry into the subject that I want in some way. I mean, thinking that Derrida in some ways tends to be more like Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which Strauss has said he thinks it's his most beautiful work, but not, of course, his greatest and, as it were, most essential work, which points to the essence of Nietzsche. But although in the case of Derrida, maybe there is no other essence of Nietzsche except in this sort of range of producing works that strike one as also, I would say, pleasurable in particular, to an ear with a certain sensitivity, I suppose. And Nietzsche, of course, aimed at pleasing sort of the ear of the educated reader, as it were. And I think certainly that's why Nietzsche is part of why Nietzsche is has the power he does, because he's one of the thinkers one can read with pleasure. The ordinary, sort of, as it were, ordinary, but the sort of ear of a literate reader can point towards Nietzsche's works and just sort of enjoy them even without really being drawn to his philosophy as philosophy. It has something like with Mishima, it has this kind of quality of a novel to some extent. I mean, because of the frequently used figures of speech he uses, and speaking of things out of the Quran and things like this, of wiping the horizontal or horizon away with a sponge, the image of the tightrope walker and the Zarathustra, and all sorts of things. But this very distinction, that we have somehow a hard distinction between the things that are really the good works, the solid works of Aristotle, for instance, on the Nicomachean Ethics, which is so revered and so treated as necessary of a kind of hard textbook version, which is not really kept to by any of the specialists who are regarded as the genuine scholars on Aristotle. But there has to be a flattened out civics ready version of this text, Nicomachean Ethics. And why? Because it's not simply a Calon or noble text or beautiful text, but because it's supposed to be the sound version, the essence of the reason that we have philosophy. But what role I mean, now we have this account of this distinction like this, and then, so what I wanted to bring this into is this question of the medieval logic, which still sort of haunts us in the form of these some little debate groups. The Brights movement, for instance, for a long time was like this. Pull out these sort of they're just lying around like so much disjecta in a yard somewhere, a piece of piping or something. Who knows what it was there for? What it was originally all about? These informal and formal logical fallacies from the time of the medieval universities. So Heidegger said about these are a fraud passed off against the students, and that there's no purpose at all to have a professor professing these to them. They could just read them and save the money on the course. Read them themselves, and that these it's sort of like what he's saying is the way logic is now understood since people have come along, like Turing, for instance, a little bit after this statement is made, Turing becomes big on the same row that's connected with the modern idea of algorithm as connected to physical machines. The new idea of logic, which sort of passed through 19th century, John Stuart Mill dominated, and then a bunch of people critiqued that, and then especially there was a split between the mostly between the Prussians and the English on some chapters of John Stuart Mill's logic. And then there's this whole discussion. But anyway, none of this that starts with John Stuart Mill and others, he wasn't the first, but he's just a big center that everyone in the leading universities, probably 8 of 10 of them being Prussian universities. I mean, you could figure a little bit. You could say also Edinburgh is maybe even much more important. I think Edinburgh probably actually was, if we write the history properly, more important than Oxford or Cambridge. So you have to say, like, maybe, I don't know, 7 of the best 10 were Prussian, something like that. In this period between the John Stuart Mill logic and the question of logic according to logic becoming a modern attachment to the sciences, and then all of a sudden, so the point is, there's this whole discussion that has nothing to do with the so-called medieval fallacies, or almost nothing. Maybe there's a few things that overlap, but basically it's a totally different tradition. So things like the various meanings of ad hominem, which turned out to have like at least 4 major different meanings, one of which is the Socratic meaning, which means that you have to, a man puts forward a doxa and then you argue from that basis. This is the original sort of ad hominem. But in any case, these things have all kinds of storied origins, and they're of sort of the worth as when you just take them sort of and make them infinite, like Tucker Carlson says, oh, I'm an absolutist on the free speech or something like that. When you just randomly make things extreme like that, and you lose all the actual sense of why the rules were put forward as sort of guideposts, when you're not in the medieval world, when you're not a scholastic yourself, when you're not for instance, in the assumption that everybody who will be your discussant will also be a co-religionist, then you have totally different wants and needs for your apparatus of so-called logic, or what in fact has no single definition. So it's like logic has most often been put forward as the art of making definitions, but in recent years it's been cast quite differently, and I think put most often as something like trying to make consistent and nonsensical statements, but then that's only when it's kept to a sort of philosophic logic. Otherwise, I think it immediately becomes mathematics, as in basically, so far as I understand it, in the Frege version already, and in sort of the way almost in the logical positivists in a certain sense. That's a different case. That's a more complicated case because it's not just formal. But in any case, the madness of this situation where something that's scholastic and tied to a totally different practice, and then people throw it out there like it has the strength of tradition behind it, or prestige, the prestige of tradition. And it becomes an entrenched sort of block to any discussion, because anybody that sees that you have a Tucker Carlson saying infinite free speech out of keeping with the original sense of the amendment, or of the right, and you get too much. Once you start to get too much of that, then it's just these are all I would call them ways to inoculate oneself against discussion for the sake of some party pre, usually, or ways of dog whistling and etc. Whatever else, the sort of use of language for the sake of the direct insistence, rather than the use of the language for something like fair reasoning, as we were sort of touching on last time. I think one can go a long way with the fair reasoning notion. I know immediately one has to maintain sort of in a booming way the answer to the question, but why isn't this just randomness? So I think, yes, this question of a kind of nihilistic assault, similar to the thing that Ramsey said when he said, his famous statement where he's saying philosophy must either somehow clear our thoughts, and or if it doesn't even clear our thoughts, we have to get rid of it, stop doing it, and regard it as nonsense, and not as interesting nonsense, as Zizek thinks it. This situation where philosophy itself is basically being put to the question, I think, is peculiar of this whole language episode, and there's some good Brian McGee stuff on this, I think. How did language philosophy come to power sort of questions. I would look at that podcast if you're at all interested, because he goes right to the actual people involved. But yeah, we have this question of how this contest between basically saying philosophy should be removed from the university. It's no longer to be distinguished from literary studies or something. And yet this struggle, it's interesting to regard the whole matter as the struggle of the sort of entrenched priests in the university who are creating their disciples through the a university is a place where there's professors are created because of the PhD programs. So unlike just a college, but there is no PhD programs. So yeah, how much of a role is this battle for? Yeah, you see the philosophy departments in that lit like that, it would seem like, oh yeah, of course they went over to analytic philosophy because that has a better general sell. It sells. It sells better. It's more. It seems more scientific. It doesn't seem like it happened that way, but I don't know. That's it. Lit like that. That's how it would appear, and it would sort of require people to. You see how these things happen? This is like, once you get a theory like that, if you take it really seriously, then you have to get historians to go back and look at it through that lens. So that's the same thing as with whether it's Howard Zinn's history or whether it's something like, oh, we want to look at the history of Lipson or Portugal, in the light of the early trans movements in the 17th century, and whether they had any self-reflective identity, or whether this term even can reach back. And we're going to study all these ancient texts simply with the eye of looking for things that would confirm or dispel that thesis. And we'll send out some PhDs to do their thesis work on this, and so we'll get a lot of data on that. Yeah, there's nothing anymore. So I would say that's a real problem, because there's there is no way to simply hold to one quartz crystal clear way of approaching history, because doing history, you're always asking a question, and it's always sort of it's as political, it has no real boundary outside itself. So that's what Heidegger has to deal with. It's like that history, however much it does within its own discipline to lay things down, is subject to a kind of essence which ultimately has to come under philosophic oversight. And he's trying to exercise philosophic oversight in a sense, in saying, yeah, the scholastic logic is the problem. And I think he is showing the remainder of it somehow, that it lingers on like this sort of a dead relative that should have been buried or something, that's still being trotted around it as though it were alive.